Hello, it's Donovan. Continuing chapter 5 from Sex and Sacrament, manuscript of almost basically everything I ever wanted to pass down to my students after 20 some years of teaching theology, church history, and in such a way that I was hoping to nourish their spiritual lives. So, this is continuing with chapter 5, which is about the prayer of union. It was the fourth kind of prayer that we've been exploring through the series. So this section is called Praying Ourselves Awake, From Half Sleep to New Life. Prayer of union is like waking up from sleep, from distracted, busy work of day-to-day living to an overwhelming awareness of the pulsing interconnectedness of everything, transcendently and fully present here and now in this moment. Bodhi Svaha. Awake, there it is, as the Heart Sutra proclaims. Buddha, which means the awakened one, and other Indian teachers have shared this through the centuries. This idea that the goal of prayer is to fully awaken. And so have lesser known Christian mystics like Anselm. Not to say within the Christian tradition, at least to theologians, Anselm is very well known, but probably to the everyday ordinary person, Anselm's not as familiar as Buddha. All right. So unlike so many of his late medieval contemporaries, Anselm didn't focus on the nuances of individual behaviors, specific venial versus mortal sins. This was what was going on in the Middle Ages. Nor did Anselm focus on the complexities of being purged from or punished for them. Talked a little bit about that yesterday. So that's the trajectory Western Christianity started to go down, and Anselm as a mystic did not follow. Rather, he focused on ancient Christians had, on the general state of human existence in which we progressively either move toward or away from God's intention for us, fullness of life and well-being. Anselm described this dynamic, moving in one direction or the other, in more physical, easily understandable terms than the Greek philosophical concepts of being and non-being that ancient Christians had used. And I talked about those a little in previous chapters with the Eastern African theologians, Athanasius and Augustine. Right? So now in the Middle Ages, we get these more physical, simple terms about just waking up. For Anselm, sin is an obscuring of the image of God in us, so that we no longer recognize God nor know God intimately as we were created to do. Let me just say this. When I say obscuring, I'm talking about like a shadow falling across so obscuring, yeah, being sort of like there's this cloud or this not the great cloud of witnesses, but like a fog or a shadow blocking our view of God within us. So we don't even recognize God anymore, even when we try to pray. Anselm calls that which impedes the soul torpor. It's kind of a dullness, a sloth, a weight. And the first task in prayer is to shake off torpor, and so be ready to enter into the experiential knowledge of God, which is prayer. In his prayers, focusing on Jesus' Mother Mary, Anselm calls sin a wound, a bite, an ulcer, a poison, a bad smell, but most of all, a torpor, a huge dullness that must be broken through. So I'm sharing all this at length here again, just trying to help those who may have been raised in a Christian tradition, maybe to find a different way to understand that tradition, because certainly, again, I've been sharing this all along. I'm sharing this series now, almost 10 years after I first wrote this book, because I'm in the US. There's an authoritarian figure, and supporters in charge who are I'm not trying, yeah, but there's a lot going on that's very similar to the feudalism of Anselm's age. There's a pandemic going on. There's a lot of things when some of our writers that I'm drawing on lived during the plague. My point is that focus in the US amongst people who are pushing religious ideas. There's a mistaken focus. I'm going to say mistaken because it's not inherent to Christianity, and that's what I've been teaching all along, and that's what we're going to look at a little bit more today. Mistaken idea of focusing on individual behaviors and punishment for those behaviors as if that's what the spiritual life is. So this whole series, these ways of prayer, and even the fact that I'm spending a lot more time in this part of the book sharing about Christian traditions, is to help those folks to realize this is not actually some of the things that you've been taught that are hurtful to you and ways that you might be hurting other people. They don't need to be part of your spiritual life. There's something, if we want to experience union with God, which is what this chapter is all about, there are different ways of understanding what this waking up in prayer is. Waking up to God, waking up to and experiencing God's love. So what's in Anselm's view, for example, this Christian mystic from the Middle Ages, what's separating us from this full love of God is something that it's nothing to be ashamed of, but it's much more like a bad smell or being half asleep. Something that's just, we need to shake off, but it's nothing to be ashamed of or feel guilty about or get punished for. I hope that makes sense. Anyway, later, in a prayer in which he meditates on the biblical example of the Apostle Peter, Anselm compares the sinner to a sickly sheep. So though he's using very different language and images here than those used by the 4th century African teachers Athanasius and Augustine, Anselm has reclaimed the ancient idea that sin is a condition of weakness from which we must recover through the healing experience of communion with God in prayer. So this kind of prayer we're going to be, I'll do the guided practice tomorrow. One of them, our first one. Anyway, this kind of prayer that we're trying to experience, to just experience being united with God. That is the healing for sin. It's not something that needs to be punished. It's something that needs to be healed. That's something that we need to be sort of shaken up and woke up to the fullness of life and love from. I cannot say that too much. I know I keep repeating it, but it's because it shocks me that so many people in very powerful positions and have large platforms and audiences in the Christian traditions are not teaching this, because this is the message of Jesus and the most heroic of the Jesus followers that some would call saints, the teachers of the Christian church, the founders of movements within Christianity. They were very consistent about not shaming people, but just helping people wake up to love. So I don't know how, yeah, I kind of do. We'll talk about how and why we lost that. And I talked about it a lot yesterday. Anselm and the ancients do not engage the medieval Western view that defines sin as shame-filled individual behaviors for which we must be punished by torments of guilt and other earthly penances. So they do away too with Christus Victor, atonement imagery. Okay, not, I mean, like King Jesus, King Christ. They do away with that atonement imagery that was so popular with feudal lords and colonialism. I talked about it a lot yesterday. I talked about it more than I intended to yesterday. But we really do need to understand that this focus on punishing individuals and this focus on shaming people, it definitely is a strategy of feudalism and colonialism. It's not part of the spiritual life that's bringing about fullness of love and helping us be a channel for love. So continuing Western Christian focus on Jesus's victory over sin as if it pays a debt for human sin to God or Satan. It's called the ransom theory of atonement for those theology nerds among us. That does not come from a living, prayerful experience of union with God, nor does it come from the sacred texts, nor does it come from the ancient traditions of Jesus' first followers. These so-called religious teachings that single out individuals to shame and punish individual acts come from the triumphalist Christendom of Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire in 9th century Europe. And I'm being very specific because this is where we start to see theologians of the church, teachers of the church, start to write atonement as doctrine in the church. It's in Europe. It's specifically part of the rise of the Holy Roman Empire, which had an imperialist agenda. It was all about Charlemagne gaining more and more land. I mean, if you know anything about church history, this part of church history, Charlemagne's the one that got crowned by the Pope. And that was a new development in church history. So church and empire mutually reinforce each other with the reign of Charlemagne. That starts a trajectory of colonialism and this very particular kind of Christology that really does not come from Judaism or the sacred texts or the ancient practices. And we need to look at where that comes from. Anyway, if we want to be mindful about what we take on and think about where it came from and why people adopted it, right? So anyway, that kind of feudalistic, triumphalist Christology of Christ is the victor over sin and paid the debt to Satan. This kind of theology, the rise of the Holy Roman Empire, it quickly brought forth the ugliness of the Crusades, and it's continued in every form of religiously sanctioned colonialism, slavery, and resource grabbing. So where we see those behaviors, we usually see this theology, and vice versa. Prayer of union, in contrast, focuses on a spirituality of imitating Jesus' self-sacrificial humanity, not the otherworldly lordship of Christ on a throne that comes from the feudal imagination that we talked about more yesterday. In prayer of union, we get a glimpse of life as being entirely transfigured by the redemption wrought by Christ. It is a world in which everything becomes a revelation of love so amazing that nothing is insignificant. Again, this is a description of Anselm's spirituality from which these mystical prayers come that I've been talking about the last couple of days. And that idea that everything that exists is a revelation of love from God so amazing that nothing is insignificant. This is a foundation really of this whole book, that everything is sacrament. Everything is a way to know God. Everything is a gift of God. Everything is a channel of God's love. If we open ourselves to experiencing it that way, everything can become a prayer and a sacrament. So these prayers, including those that meditate on the examples of earlier saints, this is something I was talking about earlier in the last couple episodes. I was talking about the great cloud of witnesses, people that came before us. You don't have to call them saints. In some traditions and practices, we talk about ancestors, elders, heroes of faith, mentors, teachers, gurus, whatever you want to call people that have pointed you in the direction of connecting with your highest truth, with the source of love. So these prayers that meditate, some of them meditate on the examples or lives of those who came before, are intended to shake us up from sleepy sinfulness or half sleep to wakeful, healing union with God, to examine ourselves, including the realities of pain and harm we have suffered and that we've caused, as an entry into meditating on the beauty of God's gracious love for each of us in spite of the reality of our sleepy, habitual, half-life, half-death. So what I'm trying to say there, what I'm trying to summarize is that, yes, these prayers, these medieval prayers of union, They do encourage us to do that prayer of self-examination that we did earlier on in this series. And again, as I said then, it's always an entry point, not so we can be in gloom and doom and shame and beat ourselves up and wallow in our grief over how horrible we are or something like that. No, it's always to say, okay, I see some areas where I need to grow. I see some areas where I've been half asleep. And when I see that honestly, or I see some places I've been wounded, I see some places where people have done me harm, and I see God loves me. I see that's not all that I am. My wounds and my shortcomings are not all that I am. It points us in the direction to say that's real. I'm not going to gloss over it. I'm not going to pretend it's not there, and there's more. So it's an opportunity to spend some time feeling the grief that we have and continue into this union with love, and what the depth of and breadth of that love is, given the reality of our wounds. So meditation on the lives of others whose lives embody this awakening from half sleep to aliveness in love is one way. It's not the only way, but it's one way to experience this sense of convicting sorrow for the reality of sin or half sleep, and delight that this is not all we are, joy and healing as we unite with the gracious love that is the source of all. For most Christians, the most popular prayer practice for connecting with others, inspiring lives, was the Litany of Saints, which started back in the 6th century, in which God is addressed directly. They don't pray to the saints, they pray to God under various titles. Some references made to God's mighty acts in and through the saint. I'm going to just change that pronoun there. And a petition is made to God through the prayers and merits of the saints, the whole prayer being offered through Christ in the power of the Spirit. So that's the way they did it in the Middle Ages. And it's a practice, as I was trying to say, that had centuries. It had started in the 6th century and it continued on through the Middle Ages. So these kind of prayers were collected in little books, along with prayers of contrition, hymns, and arrangements of extracts from the Psalms. As I was saying yesterday, with the 150 Psalms, they had it broken down to where you could pray the Psalms in a week by following them in these little segments in this little reader. So these were used for private prayer by ordinary people who wanted to share the prayerful connection with God throughout the day that monks and nuns had. Again, we talked about it a little bit more yesterday. The Litany of the Saints traditionally included asking mercy from God, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, then petitions to the saints in an hierarchic rather than a historical order. So they started with who's closest to Jesus? His mother. So they started with St. Mary, then the apostles, then the martyrs, then the confessors and religious founders, and the virgins. So these are all the people that one could pray with. Or, I was sharing yesterday, there got to be an idea that they were in the heavenly court right there they had sort of feudal understanding of what heaven would be like. So I guess God or Jesus Christ is on the throne, and these folks are all in the court with them, with God, with Christ. And then anyway, so they would make these petitions, and then they would follow by a long confession of sins. Okay, so this is, you can see the Litany of Saints gets to be a little bit more into that medieval mindset of the court and the idea of individual sins and getting really nitpicky with that. And it gets more isolating when we start picking apart, ourselves as isolated individuals for each little act or thought, or it doesn't build communion. It tends to isolate us and isolate the acts that we do and the thoughts that we have and things like that. So Anselm instead wrote prayers. He wrote prayers that were focused on the lived examples of Saint John the Baptist, Saints Peter and Paul, Saint John the Evangelist. So these are all authors in the Bible. Of the Christian part of the Bible. Saint Stephen, who was the first Christian martyr. Saint Benedict of Nursia, the founder of the first Western Christian monastic community, where they came up with the Litany of the Saints. And Saint Nicholas, the martyr after whom Santa Claus is named. And so his prayers too, they were similar to this litany of the saints. They were kind of modeled on that, but they included long passages of self-examination. As the biblical letter to the Hebrews clearly demonstrates, such prayer derives from a Jewish prayer paradigm in which one asks the help of saints, the saints specifically of the Hebrew scriptures, with reference to God's mighty acts in their lives. So in other words, they're praying this, they're looking at these examples to say, look at what God did in the lives or through these people. Even again in the letter of the Hebrews, even if they didn't themselves individually experience the fulfillment of God's promises, look what God did through them. So it's a very communal kind of understanding of how God works and how God's with us. Like, if you single out the people that didn't have the promises fulfilled in their own life, it's not helpful to look at them only as individuals and say, well, God kind of let them down. They died without getting the promise. But if you pull back and say, for the community as a whole, they were our teachers, they were our forebears, they were our forerunners, they witnessed to us, they were prophetic, they were channels of God's love and hope to us. And then it has meaning, right? So this is, again, this is the kind of prayer we're trying to do. We're not trying to stay isolated in our individuality in this prayer of union. However, taking incidents in the life of a saint and applying them to the particular needs of the present situation was a new practice of personal spiritual devotion at this time. Anselm does weave the Bible into his prayers, but his relationship with the sacred text is a living prayer. It's not a way to bully others who may or may not have access to a written text or the ability to read it. And I'm saying this again because we've gotten to a point, at least here in the US in 2020, it's been happening for a long time in a certain very powerful brand of American Christianity, to really focus on the biblical text in really authoritarian kinds of ways. So I want to look at how we pray this text from a prayer of union perspective in the Christian tradition, in the mystical Christian tradition. So, like Anselm, the more ways we can open for people to share prayer with us, the more full our hearts in a community will be. If we limit ourselves only to people who are able to own a Bible, read it, and interpret it in the ways that we think it should be interpreted, that's a very limited community of prayer. Anselm was not trying to do that. He was not trying to build fences to keep people out of faith. In Anselm's time, the printing press had not been invented yet. Bibles were scarce. They were handwritten by monks, and so there were very few of them. They were kept in monasteries. Individual families generally didn't have their own Bible unless they were extremely wealthy. So not only did he himself paraphrase the Bible freely when he quoted it, but he encourages others to do the same. Words and phrases already known are recalled to the memory as they're prayed in the heart, he says, becoming the present prayer of the one who uses them. So for Anselm, the point of praying scriptures was to have it be something that it's familiar to you, it's coming from your heart, it's the meaning of that prayer, not some sort of scholarly perfection of wording. Does it become your prayer? Does it become the prayer of your heart, the way you remember it, the way you mean it, as best you understand it, the way it's familiar to you? We don't have to start with vocal or mental prayer to connect with the great cloud of witnesses. We can connect through feeling a relational connection with others across time and space, even as we go through our busy lives. Even praying in union as we go about the nearly unceasing work of household chores and childcare, for example. And I'm saying all this to say it's not about memorizing certain words. Anselm said that, Catherine said that. In many traditions, including Christianity, we know it's really much more about a heart prayer than it is about having perfect words. So as I was sharing about yesterday off the cuff, I had actually written it here. Catherine of Siena was confined during during the same era in which the plague occurred in Italy. She was confined with a large family of about 24 people or more, and they were unsupportive of her having this. Um, I want to. They were unsupportive of her spiritual practices. They were unsupportive. They wanted her to get married. They didn't want her to be a theologian, as she was. One of the great theologians of the 14th century. One of the great theologians of the Christian tradition, period. But so she had a very reflective spiritual life that required kind of a lot of quiet and solitude and inner work, and they were not supportive of her as a woman in a large family spending all this time in quiet reflection. So her strategy was an inner mental solitude while she was physically busy. Catherine, her mentor, Father Raymond, wrote this about her. He wrote a biography of her. He said, Catherine would say again and again, make yourself a cell in your own mind from which you need never come out. Anselm also taught people to pray in the secret chamber, in the inner room of the heart, and in solitude, if possible, a kind of inner and exterior withdrawal. But again, if you can't find inner quiet, or if you can't find exterior quiet, if you're in a busy household like Catherine was, and you're running around doing stuff all day long and all night, as they both said, we can try to cultivate some privacy within our hearts and minds. Even when we're most alone, isolated, or surrounded by people unsupportive of our spiritual life, like Catherine was, in prayer of union, we can connect with others whose prayers and lived examples we join in solidarity, entering even more deeply in the fullness of the people of God as we talk with Christ and the saints as one would talk with friends. And here I was quoting Anselm. That's how Anselm described it. So even though we're alone, or even though, again, we're sort of surrounded by people who are unsupportive, our inner conversation with those with whom we're praying in our minds and hearts could be one of intimate friendship. It helps us feel less alone. I was talking about it yesterday. So some of us include mental or even physical images of our spiritual mentors as prayer aids that enhance our feeling of intimacy with God. Cuban-American Mujerista theologian Ada Maria Isasi shares that the vast majority of Hispanic women, I'm quoting her, have altars in our homes, or at least pictures hanging on the walls. Our home altars are a tangible way of making the divine present. Home altars exist in many different prayer and meditation traditions. They may include various kinds of images or tokens of cherished ancestors or spiritual teachers. These physical objects are not worshipped. They just help us feel connected to God and those who love God, or to feel interconnected with all that is. Because for those who have selected them with care, they represent our intimate relationships with various human beings and God. They're just reminders. They're not what makes us connected, but they're what they can help remind us that we're connected. And I just full disclosure, I have these little things all around my space as well. I'm renting a room, and I have pictures of various spiritual teachers and little prayer notes that I make. If you're on my Instagram, I'll from time to time I'll scribble out a prayer on an index card, and I end up posting those on my wall. But a lot of times I'll take a picture of it and put it on Instagram, and just, this is what came to me while I was studying some teacher or praying with some people, some friends. And in this pandemic, I've been doing this a lot more in the pandemic. These are all people that I'm praying with, not in my physical space, but via Zoom or somehow via the internet, or maybe I'm reading on my own or something like that. But in most cases, I'm connecting with people in shared meditation, via the internet, in live streams and interactive ones. But I'm looking off at the distance at some of these cards now. Anyway, I got that. I do that just because I want to, and at the same time, I want to say the end of the Confessions, Augustine's autobiography, there's a little epilogue where it talks about when they found him, when he was, right after he died, and before that, as he was dying, he was losing his eyesight. He had written out the Psalms, and he'd pasted these pages of prayers and Psalm excerpts and things like that all around him in his bedroom. And I always think about that now because my room's turning into that too, where they just little notes with prayers. I just always think of Augustine like that, just spending his last week in bed looking at these handwritten prayers on his walls. Anyway, so I don't know if that helps you or confuses you, but I know whenever I start talking about home altars, there's some people that get a little bit freaked out. So really all that I'm talking about here is that we all have different ways of feeling connected to the people who taught us to pray, the people who inspire us. And again, just want to circle back to, we're not worshiping physical objects, whatever they may happen to be. They're little reminders that help us feel connected. They represent our intimate relationships with various human beings and God. And that's why when you choose something like that as a little helper to your prayer life, you've chosen it. You don't have to use something that freaks you out. Choose something that helps you feel connected in the way that you want to feel connected. God's presence is invoked. This is Ada Maria Diaz again, Isazi Diaz. So she says, God's presence is invoked, establishing mutual commitment and responsibility between us and God. Our home altars clearly indicate that for us, the divine is directly accessible, even without the mediation of a specialist, an expert, a pastor, or a priest, for example. So that the point is, by having some little aids to prayer in your own home, it reminds you that, I'm allowed to pray to God myself. I don't need someone to come do it for me. I can actually, this is all about, again, this is prayer of union. We get to communicate with God in an intimate way, unite with God ourselves directly. Many of us may use candles in our prayer and meditation. Any tradition, any spiritual practice, in some way, their light may remind us or even stand for us in the presence of the divine in prayer. We light our candles, Isasi Diaz explains, we light our candles and then we go our way, confident that our burning candles represent us before God. Again, for some of us, it may be more like, for me, for example, my candle will just, seeing a light will remind me of what I'm praying. I'm praying to connect to the light, the source of all light. It kind of just keeps bringing me back from the distractions that might go on in my mind. But they, different people use these in different ways. Candles are an offering to the divine that even the poor can afford. Isasi Diaz explains. It's a way to thank God for helping us and is an act of praise to the divine without having to use words. Foods may also be included on home altars, such as bread and wine that might remind us of our communion with each other in Jesus Christ, or milk that reminds us of God's providence for us and our children through motherly nursing. This practice too exists in many different traditions, where we may offer food first to God, then distribute God's food to those who are hungry or to those who have come to share meditation, reminding us that all we have and all we receive comes first from God. And in some traditions, we call this prasad. In the words of my favorite Indian teacher, food is God. Feeding the hungry is actually worship. God comes before the hungry as food. First bhajan, I'm sorry, I'm saying that wrong, bhojan, food, then bhajan, prayer. Physical elements in prayer are important in many cultures and spiritual practices around the world. If we're uncomfortable with them, we may want to use self-examination, since suppressing them, these physical reminders that some people like to use in prayer, including, when I say suppressing them, I'm including things like disdaining them as superstitious, condemning them as idolatrous. These things are a legacy of European colonialism. So when we require literacy and advanced academic knowledge to interpret sacred texts, beliefs, and shared liturgical practices, such as familiarity with, or when we require familiarity with the original languages of our sacred texts, or awareness of the writing's original socio-historical context and audience. Not when we want those things. I mean, those are okay things to want, and I like to dig deep in those things too. But if we require them, we say, you don't know what that sacred text says. You can't pray right unless you have this advanced knowledge. Then we've placed obstacles between ourselves, others, and the God who made us all. Prayer aids that we can see, smell, feel, and that inspire memories of the connectedness to others can help any human being to locate the sacred in the midst of the marginalized, of the poor and the oppressed, in ways that prayer strictly based on text does not. Okay, so I'm going to stop there tonight, but again, I just wanted to spend a little time tonight on kind of setting, I want to say setting the stage, but that's not really exactly what it is. But it's okay for us to, if as long as Ram Dass called some of these things holy hardware. If we lean on them too hard, maybe that's not helpful. I think I need candles in order to pray, maybe I'm creating an obstacle for myself. If I think I need a certain book in order to pray, maybe I'm creating an obstacle for myself. At the same time, these things can be helpful. They're not required, but they're not helpful. They're not harmful either. The harm would come from saying, "Oh, you have to do it this way." So I hope before we do guided practice tomorrow, I hope maybe there's something here to reflect on as to what do I think is helpful to help me feel connected in prayer of union with other people and with the source of all of us that I'm trying to connect with. What's helpful to me, what's harmful to me, what things have I been maybe taught were harmful, and why was I taught that? If there's some things I'm skeptical about, are those things really obstacles to my prayer life, or are they maybe obstacles to maybe having a disdain for them or having judgment about them? Maybe that's an obstacle to my connectedness with other people. So for what it's worth, that's my last word on that. And tomorrow we will practice prayer of union with the great cloud of witnesses. It'll be sort of a guided meditation at first, and of course I hope to end in silence so you can just experience whatever union you can experience tomorrow. Okay, so it'll be a little 3-part prayer tomorrow with some silence. All right, thank you.